This program is provided by Universal Genesis.
Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're taking a deep dive into one of history's most, well, profound and frankly heartbreaking transitions.
Right.
How the global center of rational thought, of science and philosophy, the Islamic Golden Age, collapsed, and, why it never really recovered.
It's such a crucial historical lesson, and our mission today is to move beyond that general narrative of a slow, inevitable decline.
Yeah, that it just sort of fizzled out.
Exactly. We're integrating sources that let us pinpoint 3 specific acute forces.
3.
Yeah. Internal weaknesses, an intellectual purge, and then a catastrophic external shock that all converged to just dismantle the Abbasid Caliphate.
The heart of that whole civilization.
The very heart.
And our sources suggest this was a very specific kind of institutional failure. We're not just tracing a political breakdown.
No, not at all.
We're trying to identify what one source calls the literal physical destruction of the Islamic world's brain function.
That's the key phrase, brain function. We need to see how the system was already sick, long before that final external blow was delivered. Precisely. The date, 1258, when the Mongols show up, that's what everyone remembers. But the seeds of decay were planted centuries before that.
So we need to start there.
We need to identify that pre-existing internal rot that reduced a vast empire to, well, a hollow shell, incapable of defending itself intellectually or militarily.
So let's start there with that internal rot. If we were to travel back to Baghdad, say, a century before the Mongols, what would we actually see? A functioning empire.
You'd be looking at a beautiful facade. A truly beautiful one.
But just a facade.
Just a facade. The reality is that by the 11th, 12th centuries, the Abbasid Caliphate had shrunk dramatically. It was really just a symbolic power centered around Baghdad.
So the caliph himself?
The caliph had de jure authority, the legal title, the religious claim, right?
Yeah.
But absolutely zero de facto power. He was a ceremonial figurehead.
But wait, if the caliph had zero actual power, why did these powerful factions, the Turkic generals, the Persian administrators, why did they bother keeping him around? Why not just abolish the title and rule in their own name?
Because that religious title, the caliphate, it was the last universally recognized source of legitimacy across the entire Islamic world.
So he was a rubber stamp?
He was the ultimate rubber stamp.
Yeah.
Anyone who controlled the caliph could claim their own local rule was sanctified by that central religious authority. They needed his name to govern, even if they completely ignored his decrees.
They used his title as a shield.
A perfect shield.
So that institutional failure, it led to a power arrangement that our sources describe as strikingly similar to the late Roman Empire.
Yeah.
Can you explain that parallel for us?
It's an incredible parallel. Think about the later Roman Empire. You had the emperor in Rome, who was the symbol.
Right.
You had Germanic warlords controlling the armies, the foederati. And then you had powerful senatorial families running the civil administration. The Abbasids mirrored this three-way split perfectly.
So how did that actually work on the ground?
Okay, so first, the military. It was entirely controlled by Turkic Mamluk leaders. These were slave soldiers who became this undisputed martial class.
Right.
Second, the administration. The bureaucracy, the high-level civil service, was completely dominated by Persian officials. And third, the territory itself was ruled by local independent dynasties.
The Buyids, the Seljuks.
Exactly. The Fatimids. They all paid lip service to the caliph, but basically ran their own regions as sovereign states.
That sounds like 3 separate entities, all pulling in different directions, speaking different languages with different goals.
That's a perfect way to put it.
Yeah.
And the caliph's just in the middle, trying to hold ribbon-cutting ceremony.
Which leads us to what you call the most critical self-inflicted wound, the Mamluk dilemma.
The Mamluk dilemma. The caliphate outsourced its core defense.
But why? Why did they have to do that? You'd assume the empire's founding group, the Arab tribes, would keep that military power?
Well, initially they did. But as the empire grew so massive, 2 things happened. First, the scale of it required a professional, centralized, highly disciplined military.
Which the tribal armies weren't.
They struggled to provide that. And second, and this is crucial, the Arab tribes became urbanized. They became aristocratic.
They got comfortable.
They essentially traded the tent for the townhouse. And they discovered that governing an empire is a lot harder than conquering one. They lost their military edge.
So they became the political and economic elite, forcing the state to hire mercenaries.
Yes, so the state starts relying entirely on external military groups, these Turkic Mamluks, to handle security, expansion, internal control. Everything.
What was the consequence of that?
Our sources are very explicit. They identify this outsourcing of military power as the fuse for national collapse.
Wow.
The financial strain was immense, loyalty was, tenuous at best, and the military power was now completely external to the state's own political control.
So force number one is clear. The empire was hollowed out from the inside. Political fragmentation, military outsourcing, just a fragile symbolic core.
Right, and now we transition from that political and military rot to the intellectual rot.
The battle for the mind.
Exactly. The decline of reason is often seen as this, abstract philosophical mistake, but the sources show us it was fundamentally a political war.
And this is the great tragedy of the period, right? Why did this civilization that invented algebra and mapped the stars just suddenly turn its back on rational inquiry?
Because rational inquiry became identified with the losing political faction. This is where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
Aristotelian philosophy, the use of pure logic, observation, mathematics to understand the universe and society, was the intellectual bedrock of that Persian bureaucratic and scholar class we mentioned.
So how did they actually use it? What was the rational framework for governance?
They applied reason to governance. So think of things like meritocracy, predictable, non-arbitrary laws, and sophisticated mathematical administration.
Like land surveying, taxation.
Exactly. Land surveying, taxation, managing huge irrigation projects. Philosophers like Ibn Sina and Farabi were essentially proposing a secular, reason-based way of running the state.
Which often prioritized logic
over traditional text-based jurisprudence.
Yes. That makes the threat crystal clear. If the state relies on pure reason and math for law and administration, it fundamentally removes the need for religious experts.
Absolutely. The ulema, the jurists, the religious scholars, their entire power and social status came from mastering religious texts and their role as interpreters of morality and law.
And this rising tide of rational Aristotelian governance just threatened to make them obsolete.
It directly threatened their entire power base, yes.
So the rejection of Aristotle was a proxy war.
A total proxy war.
The religious scholars couldn't just attack the Persian bureaucracy directly, that would be civil war, but they could attack the intellectual foundation of that bureaucracy by labeling it heresy.
That is the crucial political insight. The rejection of Greek philosophy was about a political power struggle for control over the state's legitimacy, far more than it was some theological disagreement.
And the victory for conservatism came with Al-Ghazali?
Al-Ghazali.
The inconsistency of the philosophers, that's the famous turning point. But what did he do beyond just refuting the arguments?
Al-Ghazali was devastatingly effective. Because he didn't just argue, he integrated Sufi mysticism and theological rigor to deliver this definitive, comprehensive refutation of Aristotelian metaphysics.
So he showed that pure reason.
He showed that pure reason, if you take it to its logical extreme, could lead to conclusions that undermine central Islamic dogma.
And the result?
The result was that philosophy was decisively labeled as bid'ah, heresy, heterodoxy, and effectively removed from the curriculum of high learning.
But the sources also suggest this conservative victory, it found fertile ground with the general population. Why was there this sudden societal demand for rigidity?
Instability feeds dogmatism. Always. Look at the context we've been discussing.
Right.
The caliphate was suffering political decay, financial distress, constant civil strife, and the external pressure of the Crusades was just relentless.
So when the rational statecraft of the bureaucracy failed to deliver stability,
people lost faith in the tools of reason. They sought certainty.
Exactly. When everything is chaotic, people seek a tightening of faith, a rigorous return to the origin, not complex philosophical arguments. The philosophical tools of governance just vanished because the government itself had vanished.
And the last great proponent of that tradition, Averroes, his story perfectly illustrates the final purge.
Averroes. Ibn Rushd. He was all the way out in Al-Andalus, in Spain.
He was the final voice. He was working in Cordoba under the Almohad Caliphate. But even in the West, religious conservatism was rising rapidly.
Especially after political setbacks.
Yes. And so he was exiled from Cordoba, his own birthplace, and briefly sent to Marrakesh.
He was pardoned later, wasn't he?
He was, but the damage was done. It wasn't about the execution of a man. It was the execution of an idea.
A massive symbolic blow.
Precisely. And our sources conclude that after this intellectual victory by the ulema, philosophy, as practiced for statecraft and open scientific inquiry, it just effectively disappeared from the Islamic world. The battle for the mind was over.
So we have the empire hollowed out politically and militarily. The governing ideology has shifted away from open reason toward this defensive orthodoxy. How does that internal decay set the stage for the final external shock?
It creates a mechanism of exclusion. All that instability we talked about, financial trouble, civil war, Mamluk dominance, the Crusades, it all forced a communal return to the origin.
A tightening of doctrine.
A deep tightening of religious doctrine. And that required the explicit rejection of anything deemed foreign culture, which of course meant Greek philosophy and the sciences that came with it.
So the internal chaos forces an intellectual and cultural retreat. When you feel threatened, you double down on the one thing that feels permanent.
It's a structural dynamic. Our sources even note the parallel in medieval Europe's Inquisition. It's a societal enforcement of doctrinal purity during times of widespread anxiety.
But even a hollowed-out, rigid empire could survive for centuries, right? If it has no external rivals.
Exactly, provided it has no major external rivals. But the Abbasids had one, the one that was coming from the east.
The ultimate external catastrophe, the Mongols.
The Mongols. The end of the Abbasid Caliphate came with the fall of Baghdad to Hulagu in 1258. And Hulagu didn't just win a siege, he executed a targeted demolition of the civilization's institutional memory.
What are the specific details our sources emphasize about that destruction?
The loss was just staggering. The Library of Baghdad, the legendary Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, was destroyed completely.
And the stories about the river.
Yes. It's reported that the sheer volume of books thrown into the Tigris River was so great that the river ran black with ink. And even more devastatingly, scholars, scientists, bureaucrats, they were killed en masse.
That's not a random act of war. That's the physical eradication of the intellectual class.
Exactly right. It was the physical manifestation of the intellectual purge we just discussed, but executed externally. The sources explicitly state that the Mongol invasion destroyed the Islamic world's brain function.
You didn't just lose a city.
You didn't just lose Baghdad. You lost the central administrative, scientific, and philosophical center that had synthesized and coordinated knowledge for centuries.
And what are the long-term, irreversible consequences of losing that centralized intellectual hub?
By losing this central processing unit of civilization, Islamic civilization never regained the central seat of reason. The institutional capability to synthesize knowledge, to maintain massive libraries, to fund pure research at scale, it was permanently shattered.
And the intellectual center of gravity shifted.
It permanently shifted outward, setting the stage for the rise of Europe, which, ironically, was beginning to take up the Hellenistic tradition that the Islamic world had just jettisoned.
And politically, what happened to that symbolic authority they fought so hard to maintain?
It was gone forever. The religious authority of the Abbasid family was symbolically inherited by an exiled branch in Cairo, sheltered by the Mamluks there.
And then later, the Ottomans claimed the title.
Much, much later, the Ottoman Sultan claimed the title of Caliph, but it was a completely hollow title by then.
Right.
Our sources confirm it was a symbolic transfer designed to bolster the Ottomans' imperial prestige. The key conclusion is that despite these claims, the unified authority of Islam, that central political and religious command structure, it never revived.
It just remained fragmented.
They remained dispersed among various regional dynasties, the Ottomans, Safavids, Mughals, right into the modern era. The unified rational foundation was gone.
Wow. This deep dive has laid out an incredibly compelling sequence. First, the Abbasid state commits institutional suicide by outsourcing its military, fragmenting its political power.
Right.
Second, this political weakness fuels a vicious ideological struggle that leads to the intellectual decimation of rational philosophy.
The self-inflicted intellectual wound.
And finally, the Mongol invasion delivers the physical blow, destroying the institutional brain of the civilization.
This narrative makes it so clear that great external shocks are often only successful when that internal decay has already occurred. This deep dive really shows us how vulnerable, complex, rational systems are.
Especially during times of instability.
Especially then, when they prioritize short-term political expediency or, defensive, dogmatic rigidity over the challenging but essential cultivation of reason and flexible statecraft.
The lesson for you here is pretty stark. The moment a civilization loses its appetite for open, rational inquiry, often because of internal pressures or political infighting dressed up as moral necessity, it risks losing its capacity to recover.
So, if the loss of the intellectual center in Baghdad marked the point where the center of rational civilization irreversibly shifted to Europe, here's our final thought for you to consider. What specific examples can we identify in modern history where civilization risked intellectual decline by favoring political expediency or dogmatic rigidity over the cultivation of reason and open inquiry? And think about institutions, not just governments.
This program is provided by Universal Genesis.